If you haven't watched parts 1 to 3, please do so first. What follows depends entirely on the framework already established. We can now finally address the central question directly. Why does God command Israel to carry out what appears to be complete destruction? Throughout this series, one governing principle has guided us. Difficult passages must be interpreted in light of the whole Bible, allowing Scripture to interpret Scripture. A key biblical principle for doing this is articulated most clearly by Jesus himself when he addresses divorce and adultery. He points back to the beginning and says, in effect, that what Moses permitted was not God's ideal, but a temporary accommodation because of the hardness of your hearts. In that moment, Jesus establishes a pattern. God's ideal is one thing, human reality is another, and divine accommodation exists not as endorsement, but as a concession with a destination, a return to the ideal. That same principle must be applied here. When we ask what God's intention was from the beginning, the broader biblical narrative is remarkably consistent. God never designed his people to be a nation defined by violence, conquest, or military power. The dominant witness of Scripture presents peace, trust, and dependence on God, even at the cost of one's own life, as the true moral ideal. Violence appears not as God's preference, but as something he repeatedly restrains, limits, and redirects as he works with the people bent on going their own way. This trajectory does not emerge suddenly. It unfolds slowly across the biblical story, as God patiently works within real historical conditions, always moving his people back toward what was intended from the beginning. This means the violent commands in the Old Testament cannot be read as timeless moral ideals. They belong to a specific moment in a long story, a story in which God repeatedly adapts his dealings to the moral state of the people he is guiding. The crucial question, then, is not simply what God commands, but why he does so at that moment in history. Did God want Israel to fight? The broader biblical narrative suggests that warfare was never God's preferred method. From the beginning, Israel is portrayed as a people without military strength, dependent not on weapons or numbers, but on divine intervention. Their liberation from Egypt sets the pattern. They are not armed, trained, or mobilized for war. Instead, God acts on their behalf. This intention is made explicit in Exodus. I will send my terror ahead of you and throw into confusion every nation you encounter. I will send the hornet ahead of you. Exodus 23, 27, 28. The following verses add that this would happen gradually, little by little, for practical and social reasons, not through indiscriminate slaughter. The biblical text itself presents this as the original plan. Israel's rejection of that plan, what changes is not God's character, but the people's desires. Israel repeatedly insists on being like the surrounding nations, nations defined by visible power, kingship, conquest, and warfare. This desire reaches a decisive moment in 1 Samuel 8, when Israel demands a king. God explicitly frames this request, not as a neutral political development, but as a rejection of his own kingship. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. 1 Samuel 8:7. The people explain their reasoning plainly. They want a king to go out before us and fight our battles. God warns them in detail what this choice will bring: conscription, taxation, oppression, and violence. Yet they persist. The pattern that follows is consistent throughout Scripture. When the people insist on a particular path, God does not immediately abandon them. Instead, he accommodates their choice, regulates it, and works within it to limit harm and preserve the relationship. This is not endorsement, it is restraint. The same pattern appears earlier with the golden calf, the pillar of fire and cloud, and later with the Ark of the Covenant. God does not need visible representations, but he provides mediated forms of guidance because of the people's weakness. Nehemiah later reflects on this explicitly, describing God's guidance as an act of mercy, not necessity. Why thoroughness? If God permits Israel to fight, not because he desires it, but because they insist on it, the remaining question is why the commands are framed in such absolute terms. Here the biblical texts themselves provide the explanation. Repeatedly, Scripture links incomplete removal of surrounding peoples with prolonged instability, assimilation, and repeated cycles of violence. Judges 2 states directly that because Israel did not remove the inhabitants or dismantle their religious centers, those nations became thorns in their sides and their gods a snare. What follows is not peace, but endless conflict. Joshua echoes the same warning near the end of his life. Partial coexistence will lead to traps, snares, and future wars. The narrative logic is explicit. Incomplete separation produces ongoing violence rather than preventing it. This concern is not abstract. The biblical record shows Israel repeatedly adopting surrounding religious practices, including ritual violence and child sacrifice. These practices eventually take root within Israel itself and are cited by the biblical authors as central reasons for exile. The command to be thorough, then, is not presented as an expression of cruelty, but as an attempt to bring finality, to prevent endless retaliation, assimilation, and the spread of practices the biblical authors regard as profoundly destructive. The larger biblical picture. When read in isolation, these commands are deeply disturbing. When read within the full biblical narrative, they appear as part of a tragic accommodation. God working with the people who have rejected his peaceful rule, choosing engagement over abandonment. God's purpose remains consistent, to form a people who reflect his character and become a source of blessing to others. But the path toward that purpose is shaped by the moral reality of the people involved. These texts do not depict the God who delights in violence. They depict the God who limits it, contains it, and ultimately moves his people beyond it, even at the cost of being misunderstood. And this is where the heart of the matter finally comes into view. Throughout Scripture, God is portrayed as a God who will eventually allow his people to walk away, but only after exhausting every possible means of reaching them. The language of the prophets captures this anguish most vividly. In Hosea, God cries out, "How can I give you up, O Israel? How can I hand you over?" This is not the voice of a detached judge, but of a God torn between love and loss, pleading with a people bent on leaving him. The same grief appears centuries later when God weeps over his people as they persist in choosing their own path. Before God ever lets go, he warns, restrains, accommodates, pursues, and endures. And the ultimate expression of this is not abandonment, but identification. Rather than distancing himself from human brokenness, God enters it. He does not save from afar. He comes near. He takes on human form, lives within the limits of human violence and rejection, and absorbs the consequences himself in order to lift humanity back toward the original ideal. This reveals the deeper logic behind the Old Testament commands. They are not the actions of a God who delights in violence, but of a God who is willing to be misunderstood, to work patiently within human hardness, and to protect his people from even greater destruction as he moves history toward peace. Being like the other nations, defined by power, conquest, and violence, was never the goal. It was the worst possible outcome, and every accommodation God makes is aimed, ultimately, at preventing that end. That is the answer. This concludes Part 4.